we're Lab Zero Innovations. We've been doing software design and build work since 2008. This is what you hear today is kind of a slice of the mindset and the tools that we're bringing to our clients. And I think that, I'm not going to say anything more because we should just get into the signal part of, I'm the noise part. This is the signal. So, Brian, go for it.
All right. I'm going to open this door.
Just go for
it. So yeah, as Chris said, I'm Brian. I didn't realize my name would be so tiny on this huge screen. So that's me right down there. Been working on Elixir stuff for approaching a year now. And yeah, I guess one of the things that we ran into first off when we first started getting into it was like how to deploy. So hopefully I can help if anybody is at that same state of trying to wondering what the right way to deploy is. We'll go over that. The first thing is that like a lot of other languages or development environments, there's not like one common way to do it. You know, like in Ruby, there's almost everybody uses Capistrano, and in PHP, I don't know, they probably do something more than just FTPing individual files by now. But But what I want to do is, there's sort of two best practices. So I'll cover two, and you can choose the right one that works for you. You'll probably want to, tweak it to make it your own. But there's sort of two best practices that I see people using and that we've used here with our clients. One of them is pretty standard, like Docker deploy. We have somebody else joining, I think. Yeah, so one is the Docker way, and one is the more sort of OTP deploy or OTP release way, which is offers a little bit different features. And depending on your situation, one of these or a variation of one of these will probably be what you want. And then a good rule of thumb that we use is choose one of these based on like what your organization is already used to. Chances are Elixir might be new to your organization if you're working on it, or if you're trying to convince people to try it out on a project. And you don't want to necessarily introduce another learning curve of doing releases in a totally different way. So if your ops team is already used to something like Docker, then use Docker. And if they're used to something like Capistrano and that's how they're comfortable, then you might be interested in the OTP releases. So just to start off, this is the basic workflow of a deploy. You have some raw code. In Elixir, you need to compile it, which would be the build step, and package it in some sort of way. And then you just, you deploy it. And here this is simple. We're just showing deploy to one set of servers, but in a real world, this would be multiple deploys. One deploy to staging, one deploy to production. Maybe you have a deploy to test environment. But to keep things simple here, I'm going to use this, and we're just going to pretend there's just one deploy. And if you have questions at any point, raise your hand, yell, throw empty bottles at me. So yeah, the first way I'll go over, so like I said, there's going to be two ways I'll go over. The first one is Docker. It's pretty straightforward. If you're familiar with Docker, this is going to be probably pretty easy. It's just, there's a couple images that are really handy for doing Elixir deploys. Both of the ones that I'll show here use Alpine Linux. It's a very small, lightweight, secure, and we've done a couple with Ubuntu, and the images were just huge. There's a lot of like paring down you have to do with the stock Ubuntu images, and it's not totally worth it. Because then you're copying around like 500 megabyte minimum Docker images. So Alpine Linux is sort of becoming, from what we see, the standard for Elixir deploys in Docker. Sorry, I wrote too many notes, so I gotta read them all. Yeah, this doesn't give you the full power of the OTP releases, which I'll go over next, but it does give you the comfort of most ops teams are already comfortable using Docker, and so it's probably an easy sell. So Docker, if you've been living in a cave for the last few years, is a containerization platform. Make virtual or containers that you can deploy that have your application and your system image kind of all in one. And in our little diagram, Docker kind of covers this build section, and it covers some stuff. When you actually deploy it, you can do some additional stuff. So it doesn't handle the deploy part for you. You still have to use your existing automation to handle that part. And then the asterisk is there because there's a compile step that happens depending on how you do it. This build can be you can use an Elixir or Erlang package manager to build and load it into Docker, or you can have Docker actually do your compile and build stuff. It depends on a little bit on whether or not you're using Phoenix, and a little bit on how fast you want your Docker starts to be, Docker runs. So to jump in, this is the basic. If you're just having an Elixir application, you're not doing Phoenix, you're going to use something like Distillery, which I'll go into later on in the talk, to build your application. And this is a simple Docker file. You just set some ports that you're going to use. You set some environment variables. You pull in your tarball, which was created by Distillery. And then when the Docker image runs, it just runs your app in foreground mode. Make note of this URL. So Bitwalker, you'll see in you'll run across him in a lot of the Elixir deploy stuff. He also has created a couple Docker images. One for if you're just using straight up Elixir, and then there's another one that does it has a little bit extra stuff if you're doing Phoenix, so it has Node and stuff like that built into it. If you're using Phoenix, it's slightly more involved, but it's still pretty straightforward. There's a different image which pulls in a little bit of extra stuff. Most notably, it's going to have NPM and stuff installed. So same thing, set us some environment variables. In this example, we also pass some environment variables in as a parameter to the build, just so that our CI can customize this as needed. It's not, the Docker purists will get mad at this, I'm sure. And then it just does the steps that you have to do when you're running a Phoenix application. So it's not gonna use any sort of packaging. It's gonna pull in your dependencies, cache those in the intermediate Docker image. Same thing with your Node dependencies. That's so that you don't have to compile that stuff every single time you're going to build a new image. And then finally, you're going to add in all the files in your project directory. You're going to load it into the Docker, and then you're going to do the branch build to get all your front end stuff, and you're going to run Phoenix Server. And you're going to compile the app, and then lastly, when the image starts up, you're going to run Phoenix Server. So this is a simple version. We usually, right around here, we have some additional stuff. So one example is if we have an API, we're going to build Swagger docs. So we have a couple extra commands that are going to compile the Swagger JSON file, put it in the right spot. If you have any additional build steps, you'll probably want to put them somewhere, depending on where you want to cache them, because the order of these lines does matter in how it caches these images. And then this is the most basic use, just running Phoenix Server. If you want to run a series of mix commands, I might have it on a slide later on, but in case I don't, you just do mix, comma, do, comma, and you have to have do, comma inside the quotes and then a comma. That tripped me up first time I did this. I forgot that comma inside the quote, and it drove me crazy. So you can have things like maybe you want to run your migrations in your image when you start it up. You could have that in here, and then lastly run Phoenix Server. So this is a build command in this scenario where I'm sending in a couple environment variables. Because the environment variables are compiled in, they have to be there when the thing is compiled. So in this example, we're actually running the, compile when the image is built. So we have to have those environment variables set. So we pass them along in our build command, tag it. If you're using Circle CI, Circle version 1, version 2 is in beta right now. You won't have the problem if you're in version 2, but if you're in version 1, it doesn't cache those intermediate images, and you'll get all kinds of trouble if you try to do this in Circle CI. Things won't work, and you have to tell Docker not to remove the intermediate images while it's building. So you pass in --rm equals false as a parameter here, and then it works fine in Circle CI 1. If you're using Circle CI, use the 2 beta. I think I applied to get into it, and it was like less than a day, and they pulled me in. So I think almost anybody who requests, I think, is getting into it. And it has native Docker support right away out of the box. So you don't have to worry about all that stuff. When it comes to deploy, you just deploy it however there's nothing special. You just deploy it however you normally deploy your Docker images. In our case, we usually are deploying to ECS. So we have a couple scripts that we load into our CI servers that automate that ECS deploy. In this slide back here, that basic case, we're just running Phoenix Server. That's probably what you want to do unless you have a very simple case. You probably don't want to run your migrations in your image, because if you're deploying it to a bunch of servers, you don't want them all trying to run migrations at the same time. So you can just use Docker run to run your migrations, and that can be part of your CI or however you decide to do it. There's a warning here. Environment variables in Docker, there's some caveats, some things that you definitely want to consider. So in this example, we're compiling the environment variables into the Docker image, just because it's easy to show. But if you do that, when you build the Docker image, you're going to have your DB password or whatever other sensitive information. You're going to have it in your Docker image, which is probably not a good idea. You probably want to set those at runtime when the Docker image is started up. And that's left to you guys as homework when you build it.
Is this because of the means relationship with the system, or is it more of an OTP thing?
Yeah,
because in another language universe, we might read from a properties file that was on disk, or we might use in a Docker world, if there's a Docker host, that has some environment variables that are on that host that we would just, that would be injected in.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways to do it. So the main issue is that in a config file, it's compiled. So you need your settings to be there at compile time, because it's going to be compiled into the Beam bytecode. What's that?
We need some of them.
Yeah. So there's some solutions where it just provides a helper that basically, like in your config file, it just calls a helper, which at runtime, that helper will go look at an environment or a settings file or whatever and load it in at runtime. There's also there's a parameter you can pass called replace, I think it's replace OS vars, so all caps replace _OS _vars, which you can do. Oh, did I put that slide in here? I think I have. Oh, I believe I have it later on when I go into environment variables in a little more detail. So there's another way that you can load them in at runtime. That's sort of, I think, the more standard way to do it. It's just a little more complicated to show in the Docker land, but something to keep in mind. You probably don't want your environment variables living in your Docker image if it's not running. Is there any questions about the Docker thing? It's pretty straightforward. That's basically it for the Docker part. I'll move on. So the second way is using Distillery and eDeliver. So Distillery is a package manager that builds an Erlang OTP release for your application. It gives you a lot more of the features that you use or that you lose by going to Docker. So one of the fun, fancy things is to do hot code upgrades. So while your application is running, you can do a release and it'll just do a hot update to your code like while it's running. You don't have to take your application down or your project down. Distillery is the current way to do that. They hit version 1.0, I think, was released in just recently, January, if I recall. Maybe it was early February. It's a predecessor of a package called XRM, which was up until, I don't know, maybe halfway through last year, sort of the normal way that people were doing this. But it had a lot of issues with umbrella projects. They just didn't quite work. So Bitwalker, again, decided to restart from scratch, pure Elixir, dependency-free. It's a drop-in replacement for XRM. And it supports the hot code reloading. It works with umbrella projects. That was like one of the main features. He wanted to make sure it works. A distillery release bundles Erts with your application. So when you deploy it, you don't need to make sure that you have OTP installed on your hosts because it's all bundled into the release package itself. There's some caveats about that I'll go over. So if we look at this again, this distillery handles just this build and package phase. eDeliver is built on top of a release tool called Deliver. It's just shell script, no dependencies, and it works with any number of it works with a lot of packaging release package managers, but Distillery by default, and I think they kind of encourage Distillery. You can use it for like your Elixir or your Erlang projects too. It's not dependent on one or the other. So in this picture again, now we have eDeliver kind of wrapping around all of this stuff. It handles the build by using Distillery or whatever you want. It'll handle the deploy. It'll handle deploying to a staging and a production. It doesn't support anything more than that out of the box. And then when you have it deployed, it gives you all the admin stuff of like starting your application, stopping your application, restarting, doing an upgrade, like a hot upgrade, checking to see if what servers are running what version, etc. Installation is super easy. Since none of these have dependencies, you just install Distillery, you install eDeliver, or add them to your dependency list. You have to have this warn. I believe you still have to have warn missing false on Distillery, or when it builds the package, you might get an error. And then the same thing with Elixir 1.4. I'm not sure if you need to add eDeliver to the application list or not anymore because of the new dependency inference stuff. But you have to make sure that this is the last thing in the application list. It's called out in the documentation in a couple places, and if you don't have it at the end, it may not work correctly. So it has to be the last application on the list. And then to configure Distillery, there's a config file. It's pretty straightforward, so you can define environments. You can define releases. Most cases, you'll probably just have one release, which is your app. If you have an umbrella app, you can bundle apps together. So in this case, like utilities here, we're going to pull in 2 applications into one release. Things to note, dev mode will let you deploy this release locally. And it will, instead of bundling your code, it will just link to it so you can still modify your code and not have to redeploy. And as I mentioned a few slides back, these releases bundle Erts into the release. So you want to make sure on production that you include IRTs. I believe when it auto-generates this, it's going to have that there for you by default as include IRTs true. You can, if you want, you can set this to the path to a different IRTs, but this has to be the IRTs that matches the architecture that you're going to deploy to. If it doesn't, it won't work. Even though the bytecode for your application is like cross-platform because it runs on top of Beam, the Beam that's bundled is not. So you have to make sure, there's a way you can point this to you can point this to the path of an IRTs for, like, if you're building on a Mac, you can point it to the path that's like Ubuntu, but it's just easier to do it this way with eDeliver. It's gonna help you with this, which I will get to.
So just to be clear, that means that when we run the build, and if you want to include IRTs, that the IRTs needs to be compiled for the target architecture, likely on that architecture. That could be a remote build node if needed.
Yeah, you can
to have the right architecture.
If you set include IRTs to false, it will try to find IRTs on the target system when it runs. Then you have to make sure you have OTP installed on the target system, which may be easy to do, and it may find it totally fine, but if you don't want to worry about any setup on the target, you can just include the IRTs that you know is going to run on the target. eDeliver configuration is also super easy. So this is inside a .deliver directory inside your main project directory, a file that's just called config. And because eDeliver is all shell script, you're just going to define environment variables. So a lot of these are straightforward. So I guess I didn't, back at this, let's go back to this slide here. So this build step with eDeliver, it actually will happen on a remote build server. You point it at your target architecture. So if I'm on my Mac and I know we're going to deploy this on an Amazon Linux instance, then I'll point it at an Amazon Linux build server. And it will actually go out, build it on that server, copy it back locally, and then have it ready to deploy. So in the config, I set that host name for the build server. It's just one host name. You set the build user. You tell it where you want it to build, and it will set this up for you. It actually pulls down your Git repository into whatever this directory is, and it will build it on that remote server for you. For staging and production hosts, you can point it at a cluster. It's just a space-separated list for the host names. You give it the user as well, and you point deliver to wherever you want it to actually install your application. And there's one deliver to, it uses the same setting for staging and production. You may be wondering, you may have noticed that I don't have any authentication stuff here. Because this is all shell, it's going to use your local SSH settings or your SSH agent for the keys or for the passwords. So you can either load your identity files into the agent before you run your builds, or you can just set up your SSH config for the build user with the necessary identity file locations and usernames and all that other stuff. So this is what I was saying before with the environment variables. You're going to have something in your config file here where you're like system.get.env for your whatever your sensitive information is. When eDeliver runs your compilation, the environment has to be set on the build server. And because it's all shell, it expects you to put them in the profile, in the .profile of the remote user on the build server. So if you're like here, we're using Ubuntu as our build user on buildmyapp.com. So I want to make sure I define GitHub token, Wonderground token, and Mopedy API URL in .profile for that user on that host. If you're interested in not setting these at build time, or at compile time, you want to load them in when the release is started. this is when you can use that replace OS vars. The way to do that is to specify your environment variable inside curly brackets, preceded by a $sign inside quotes. And what that does is it puts this into a settings file. And then when you start your release, you make sure you have replace OS vars equal to true in your environment. And when your release starts up, at that time, it will read your settings, your environment variables, rewrite them. It'll read anything was specified in that order. It'll rewrite them into that like intermediary config file that's used by the release, and it'll load it up as your application starts. There's some additional setup that you need to do. eDeliver has no dependencies, but you actually do still have to install a whole bunch of dependencies on the build server. There's no dependencies on the deploy target as long as you're bundling Erts. But on the build host, you have to make sure you have OTP installed. You have to make sure you have Elixir installed. You need Git. You need, on Linux at least, you need the build essential package installed. And you need libssldev installed. And that will get you, and you know, with a lot of default systems, like most of this will be there. I think like on Ubuntu, I think build essential is not there usually.
Is Elixir, installing Elixir install OTP as well?
If you yum install Elixir or whatever, I think it will pull in OTP. And then on, like I said before, on your local, whatever is going to be running the eDeliver commands, you have to make sure your SSH keys or whatever settings you need in order to like communicate with your remote host is set up. And then once everything's set up, it's easy from there. So mix eDeliver build release will build the release. It will connect to the remote server. It'll do some stuff to your Git repository. It'll do like a hard reset or whatever to make sure that it's clean. And then it'll run your distillery release command. So I think just it runs mix release, builds a distillery release, pulls back the archive we can see here, and stores it in a local release store by default. So by default, it is .deliver/releases, and then all of your releases will be stored in there. If you prefer, you can have it save all your releases on a remote host, which you would just specify username at remote host as the release _store environment variable. You can have it save those to S3, and in the in the eDeliver documentation, it has like the right format for that release store variable. If you want to do a hot upgrade, you have to build an upgrade package. You can't build a release package and use it for hot upgrades when you deploy. So to do a hot deploy or a hot upgrade, you do mix eDeliver build upgrade, and then you have to send it a Git revision or a Git tag so that it knows like where to create the diff or whatever for your release. And then this is deploying a release. So here we're deploying it to production. Mix eDeliver deploy release to production. You can skip the to if you want it to sound more robotic. It will still work. This actually pushes the release out to production. That's all it does. It pushes it out, and I believe it untars it. It doesn't do anything else, so you will not have a running release after this. And then if you want to deploy it to staging, you just put staging there instead of production.
That versioning, the 0.1.0, that's probably hard-coded in our Elixir app, isn't it?
Let me go back to the config here. So that's specified in the in the distillery config. So this is the preferred way you want it to grab the release that is in your application. If you want to, you can actually hard code it in here as well. But typically you'll do this. This gets tricky if you're using an umbrella project. So you will have to either write a little helper to deal with how to version it, or you just hard code it.
The reason I'm asking is because eDeliver seems to have some knowledge about using Git for versioning, and our Git hash, is the lightest weight way of tracking a version. Does this system, right now I see 0.1.0, that's a major, minor, tiny kind of pattern. Does it always assume major, minor, tiny, or could you throw a Git hash in there too?
You could throw a Git hash in there. In eDeliver, it's just an environment variable. It's like whatever is stuck in the release version environment variable it uses. It can be a string, it could be.
So if we were using a Git tag, for example, we could read the tag.
Yeah. And if you want to do a hot upgrade, instead of deploy, you just mix eDeliver upgrade production is going to do an upgrade on your release. And that only will work if you have built an upgrade in the previous step. And then there's a bunch of administration commands. The most obvious one is like you've pushed your release out there, it's not running, so you have to mix eDeliver start production to get it running. You'll get a response back. This does not always return values, but a lot of times it will start production, but response will come back as nothing. Just something to look out for. Don't panic. It just means you gotta check to see if it's running. If you want to, you don't want to run all those commands. You can do all of this stuff in one command. Mix, eDeliver, update, production, -- start release. That will build the release, copy it down, archive it locally, push it out to production, and start it up.
I assume that when we do a start, it manages graceful shutdown of the other, or do we still have to manually shut down?
Yep, it handles the, yeah. I believe if you do this, that's a good question. I don't recall. Yeah, I forget how that, because in our automation, we do it slightly different, where we make sure that the old one is stopped. If you're doing hot upgrades, it doesn't matter. So this is, I believe this might be all the other administration commands. There might be some more. So there's stop, restart, ping will check to make sure the remote hosts are responding. Version will return the currently running version. And then show migrations and migrate will show you if there's pending migrations, or it'll run your migrations.
All these commands don't operate directly on the host, they go through the build server?
These all run on the production or staging hosts.
Okay.
Yeah. I'm not sure with migrations. I should check to see exactly how those work. Because obviously, yeah, with the migrations, that's a good question. So some things to look out for. eDeliver does not support Distillery 1.0 yet. So this is, I actually have a branch that I started making it work, but there's still a lot of work. So with Distillery 1.0, you can actually change the output directory of where your resulting release is stored. And by default, eDeliver will have no idea about this. So if you change output directory in your Distillery 1.0 release, eDeliver will not be able to find it. If you are using this, then search the open issues on eDeliver. There's an open issue right now that has a workaround that works, and we're still working on trying to get this working. And then there's a race condition that we spent forever trying to figure out. There's a weird race condition with eDeliver right now on slow hosts, as it turns out, which we didn't realize that was the cause until we spent a lot of time on it. And I believe that's also the issue with this sometimes not returning a response. So if you're running, say you're running an Amazon Micro, you may notice when you run your mix eDeliver start on production, it may not ever start up your application. And when you look at the logs, you'll get an error about an empty Erlang tuple or something. I forget exactly what the error is, but you'll get you'll get like an error that it can't read one of the config files for the release. And there's some stuff in eDeliver that when you start it up, it rewrites this config file and then it starts up your app. And the race condition is like it'll start up the app before it's done writing that config file. So the config file won't be there instantaneously like when the app is starting up. So if you start seeing weird things, you can either run it on a faster instance, or you can write a little, like in one of our releases, we actually want to run it on a micro. And so we have in our distillery, or sorry, in our eDeliver CI deploy stuff, we actually have like a bash loop that basically runs a start and sees if it starts, and it just retries. I think we have it like retry 10 times, and then it always starts on like the third or fourth one. So you'll have to do something weird. It's probably easiest to just not run on micros.
Which app did you observe that one? Was it DJ or is it
That was on Clippy X, yeah. Probably the most important project we have at LabZero. It's our Slack chatbot. That's it. That's all I have. Any questions? Comments?
I find it fascinating how we do things in the Erlang world and in the Elixir world.
Yeah.
But that very much, I think, depends on the types of systems we are deploying. Which is mainly enterprise, highly secure, highly safe,
Yeah, so you're not storing your environment variables with passwords in your Docker images?
Let's put it this, one system we're working on, we actually had security audits going through running tools in every single line of C code and looking for, just the fear of being able to inject code is just, it is massive. And so, if you think we had a package manager probably 12, 13 years ago, it never took off because those were not the types of problems we're solving. And so it was there, but then people weren't using it. They were forking it. They needed to know exactly. They actually go even as far as to actually fork all of the source code from the Erlang VM and push it in.
Oh.
If you look at Erlang solutions, literally that is the level. Some switches you don't even have internet access to them. You need to track with your boots and umbrella in the Swedish woods and then plug an Ethernet cable into the switches themselves. And then you've got the other side of the spectrum where you go in, you pull it, you'll deploy, you'll pull in the Erlang solutions packages and do that automatically. And just there, there are probably, let's say, Erlang solutions packages about 30,000 downloads per month of the packages themselves. And the reaction there is you could theoretically put any factor in there, which obviously we don't. But that's the mentality. So it's
As for projects at LabZero, we do continuous delivery.
Yeah.
The way we tend to kind of address the security or compliance concerns is we do test story acceptance, if you will, in the test region. The test region is under is under change control. It needs an RFC to make any change in tests. And the promise we make is that the thing that everyone at the QA tested and that product accepted is the exact thing which we deploy to production. And that's so getting that binary, if you will, to be the same and only one.
Yes.
Is how we tend to slay those dragons. If we can cryptographically prove or mathematically prove that what we deployed hasn't been tampered with.
Okay, brilliant.
Then that's what it is. And so then we put controls around the package manager or the package repository, if you will, which could be Nexus, could be controls around an S3 bucket, could Jenkins, whatever.
Yeah.
And so the thing that comes to mind here is the environment variables things is the thing that is the most curious to me, that feels different, and that, okay, in Java, we can just say system.get property type thing, and and here we have to compile that in. So it feels like, if I was to imagine a tool kind of emerging, it would just be some really clean Elixir tool that reads config files and is like your config bridge, gateway, if you will, to config files, that we can still have a single binary be deployed to any environment.
I assume you'll have a single installation with most of your systems.
Correct, right, yeah, that's right. There's an assumption there. And then, I guess there's a second curious thing, Brian, is that, so the reason you would get a lot of ad hoc deploys would be for stateful web applications, so stateful WebSocket, for example.
Zero downtime.
True zero downtime.
None of your WebSockets will get cut in the middle of
Are you
it.
actually doing release upgrades?
What's that?
You're doing actually release upgrades?
We don't have any of those use cases yet, but I'm imagining like that's the use case for where the Docker metaphor doesn't really fit.
No.
Yeah.
And so I'm no Docker expert, but can you just go in and actually change, so
Actually, you can
so
do.
the way we would do it in the Erlang world is, okay, you're upgrading from release 1.2 to 1.3. The end solution of doing the upgrade is the same as creating a new Docker container with version 1.3. So your end results has to be the same. But you have two routes of doing it. One is you build your 1.3, and the other is you upgrade to 1.3. But the final solution is that not possible with Docker?
I don't know that anyone's doing it that way. Yeah. The Docker has a promise of idempotency with the various file systems. So every one of those run lines or add lines produces another disk file system image, and that thing needs to be immutable. So I feel like I'm making this up right now.
No.
I suspect that we're violating an immutability concern of Docker if we upgrade an existing container.
Yeah, but because you need to be able to. What you do is you place the upgraded files in your lib directory.
That's right.
So you need that.
So if we wanted to then be able to know what we had, so then I think what we're doing in production today is we're using ECS. We're just letting the Amazon Container Service manage our fleet. And
it's essentially a rolling deploy. We'll start up the new one.
Restart a task. And on the task defines all the environment variables, some environment variables.
So the approach we would take there would be to have front-end nodes and back-end nodes. So we would keep we would keep the WebSockets open, and the front-end node there'd be minimal. It would just basically what you do in the front end is you receive the request, you do the parsing, and you convert it to internal format, and then you send the request to a back-end node. So which means you refer to logic nodes, and that means all you need to do is you deploy a new logic node.
I like that.
And you copy over the state, and so you basically need to balance the state, and then you just reroute to the new nodes.
So this could be an umbrella app where you've teased out the WebSocket concerns, your capabilities to its own application.
Yes.
That totally makes sense. Yeah. Cool. So we're doing this, Brian, we're doing both ways right now.
Yeah, we do both of
OTP
these.
deploys as well as Docker.
That's it. Thanks for coming, everybody.
Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.